Okay, hello everyone. My name is Martin Hykel and I'll be having a presentation on the types of work contracts and basics of labor law. I'm an attorney in company Či Advokáti. We're in the center of Ostrava. We're a company focused on business law and labor law as well. I was asked from Expat Center to have a presentation for the expats, mainly focused on their work contracts as language teachers, but for all the expats as well. So let's start. Here's the content of the presentation. We will start with trades license activities or self-employment. Then we'll go through basic labor relationships. After we'll do a little insurance and social security. And at the end, there'll be questions. I'm not sure if that's going to be recorded or not. If you have any questions, save them till the end. Thank you. So, trade license activities is called OSVČ in Czech law. It's called živnostník. It means like a businessman. This is not a labor relationship per se. It means that you're a businessman as well as the company that orders your services. So you're the provider of the services, not an employee. It's very important, this difference. The relationship between the provider and the customer or the orderer is settled by contract. It don't have to be written, it can be only oral, but it's always better to have it written. If you want to become a self-employer, OSVČ or živnostník, there's a license you need to get. It costs 1,000 Czech crowns. This relationship is not a relationship of superiority and subordination, which is a characteristic for employment contracts. So this is one of the differences. There is one very important thing for you, and that there's no protection similar to the employees. The employers are governed by the labor code, which are protecting both sides, but not in this relationship. Payment for the services is always settled between the parties. It's not governed by any limitations. But if you're a OSVČ, you don't have any employee benefits. You're just a businessman responsible for your own. So there's a big responsibility in general. It's really cheap for both sides. That is because there's no social paid from the order party or the customer party, but you're the one who's paying the social for itself. You pay for your own social and health insurance. There's one thing I'd like to point out, and that it's something called the Schwarz system. That is something that looks really a lot like an employee relationship, but it's not. It's an OSVČ. It's something that's illegal in Czech Republic. It means that you're self-employment, but you only work for one client. So you're like pretending that they are not in the employee relationship, but you actually are. So this is one thing to be aware of. On the other hand, there's the labor relationship, so employer and employee relationship. This is a relationship of superiority and subordination. Wage, salary, or other remuneration paid automatically by the employer. There's no invoicing. The OSVČ, the živnostník, gets the money from invoice that's paid by the orderer. There are many benefits and protections of this labor relationship. And the employer has to pay social and health insurance for the employee automatically. So that's a big benefit for you if you're in a labor relationship. There are more types of basic labor relationships. The most common and the strongest one, it's employment relationship. There's an employment contract. Sometimes it's called a full-time or part-time job. It's like the big contract for work 40 hours or so a week, but there are little lower agreements, and those agreements are called agreements performed outside an employment relationship. They are all governed by the labor code, but there are different laws and obligations for the both employee and employer. There are two agreements typical, and that's an agreement to complete a job, or dohoda o provedení práce, DPP, or agreement to perform work, dohoda o pracovní činnosti. I will get to all of these during the presentation. So these are the basic differences. I already told them, but to summarize, the employment relationship, mostly full-time, highest level of employee protection, lower flexibility. It's all governed by the labor code. Agreements on work performed outside an employment relationship, which are the dohody or agreements. They are most common for the part-time jobs. There's way higher flexibility for both parties, but there's also lower level of the protection, mostly for the employee. So let's start with the employment relationship. This one's established by an employment contract. It has to be in writing. It starts on the date which has been agreed in the employment contract, the date of employment beginning. So even if you close the contract right now and you have the day of the employment beginning is the 1st of September, the employment relationship starts in September on the date which is settled in the agreement, or in the contract. But you're also already bound by the contract now. But the relationship starts itself in September, or the date which is in the contract. Those are mostly used for a long-term and close cooperation between the parties. So it's usually offered to the employee when the employer knows that there's going to be longer, more likely for years of cooperation. Employee must be assigned work within the scope of the standard week working hours. So the working hours per week means a period of time which the employee is obliged to perform work for his employer to his employer's instructions. It's usually set for 40 hours per week. Sometimes it's a little less. Or you can be a part-time work, but still in an employment relationship. That means that you don't work 40 hours per week, but you can work for 20, 30, or 15 hours. This is not very common for the reasons of the social and health insurance benefits that they don't come for the employer in this relationship, but I'll get to that later. So usually when you see an employment relationship set by the labor contract, it's for 40 hours per week. What are the benefits of this relationship? There's the highest level of employee protection. It first starts with a trial period, something it's called zkušební doba in Czech Republic, which is a period where both parties can try if it works for them. It's not obligatory, but it's highly recommended. It's usually 3 months, but it can be up to 6 months if there's a managing position, but usually there's 3 months. Be sure to have this in your working contract. The thing why trial period is settled is because there's a very easy termination of the employment on both sides. And that is so easy that you can only, without any reason, you can terminate the agreement any day, any hour, and you stop, just get out of the relationship. That only works for the first 3 months or for the trial period itself. After that, it's way more complicated to get out of the relationship. The employee in an employment relationship is entitled to work leave with pay. You're entitled to work breaks. And there's another absence of the employee from work for certain reasons with remuneration. It's called obstacles at work, temporary incapacity for work, maternity leave, parental leave, and so on. As I told before, after the trial period, it's very hard for the employer to get the employee out of the relationship. There's always the possibility of an agreement. So if both parties agree to terminate the agreement, it's their free will. If they have it in writing, there's no problem. But if the employee don't want to get out of the relationship, it's really hard for the employer to terminate this. It's done by notice of termination, but there are very strictly settled reasons why the employer can do that. On the other hand, the employee can have the notice of termination anytime without any reason. There's also an immediate termination. As well, there's only 4 reasons according to the labor code. Those are like a major faults by the employee. I don't know, I can say like stealing the employer's property and so on. This is something that's so important that the employer can terminate the agreement immediately. Those reasons are very specific and also in the labor code. Social and health insurance is paid by the employer. It's paid from the salary. Both employee and employer are paying it from the salary. So there are like usually it's called čistá and hrubá mzda. So the higher number is something that the employer is paying, and the lower number in your working contract is something you get on your account. That is the wage, and there's the salary that's not that's final. So from these insurance is paid the sickness benefit and entitlement in future pension. So that's a very strong benefit for the employee. Usually, I was asked to have it specifically for the lecturers in language schools. Usually, it's not typical for the language school teachers to be employed on an employment relationship. That is because the language schools usually don't have the workload for the whole 40 hours per week. That's why the lecturers are usually employed under the agreements I've spoken on before. The agreements on work from outside the employment relationship or as a self-employed persons. That's the first type I was talking about. The agreements offer a more advantageous opportunity for the employers to employ employees to perform work for a limited part of time. So it means that when the employer wants you only for a few months or 1 year, or he knows that you're going to be coming to work only for a few hours every week, they're going to offer you the agreement outside an employment relationship, or they're going to ask you to be self-employed persons. If I go through the agreements, the first one, agreement to complete a job, dohoda o provedení práce. This is a typical, most typical for part-time jobs. You can have more of these agreements signed at one time. You can work for more employers. You can also work for one employer on more agreements if you have different types of work for him. There's a limitation for the agreement, and that is that the scope of work may not exceed 300 hours in a calendar year for one employer. Agreement must be in writing, and there's a termination notice only 15 days long without any reason. Also, you can do it by agreement as well. But there's no legal entitlement of leave with pay, work break, severance pay, reimbursement for travel expenses if you don't have it in the agreement itself. So if you manage to put it inside the agreement, you can have this with your employer settled. That is why it was so hard during the past crisis for most of these most of the workers working off agreement to complete the job, so they didn't have any compensation from both states or the employer. There's no trial period in the agreement to complete a job, and there's another limitation, and it's 10,000 Czech crowns entitlement. After that, you have to pay for a sickness benefit and future pensions. After that, you have to pay social and health insurance. So that is usually why the employer always tries to have the wage from the agreement under 10,000 Czech crowns. After that, it's more expensive for both parties. So if it's for a short period of time, it's the most favorable relationship from the salary. But if you're getting paid under 10,000 Czech crowns, again, there's no social and health insurance, so no social benefits at all. The other one, agreement to perform work, it's a little different. There's no limits on the numbers of hours worked per year, but you can work more than 20 hours on average per week. It's not like that you work 25 hours one week and the other one is 10, that's fine, but there's an average. So this is what's usually used for the part-time workers that are, when they are not offered employment contract to settle an employment relationship, and the employer tries to keep them out of the employment relationship, so they offer them agreement to perform work. Both the agreements must be written in writing, and there has to be a description of the scope of work and the type of work the employer will be doing. As well, there's a 15 days long notice period termination, and it can be submitted without any reasons. Agreement as well, as always. As well as the other agreement, there's no legal entitlement for the paid leave, work break, severance pay, and the other end, if you don't have it settled in the agreement itself. There's a limitation too, and this one is way lower. It's 2,999 Czech crowns. Below that, you don't have to pay any social, but if you go over this limitation, there's both the employee and the employer have to pay for their social security. There's no trial period as well. So if I made a little chart for you. I hope it's clear. All the stuff I just said, it should be in this chart. So there's a notice period. I use the shortcuts for the employment relationship and the agreements, which is the DPP and the DPC. So if you have any trouble with understanding this chart, feel free to ask me, or later I'll be happy to explain this. So what is the best way and why and for whom? So the employment relationship, as I told, this is the best way for the employee because it's the strongest relationship if you have a full-time job. Social and health insurance is included, sickness benefit and both the future pension, it's paid both by the employer and the employee. And there are other advantages of being employed in the employment relationship, which is really hard to get the employee out of the relationship if the employee is not breaking any law codes or a labor code. It's the most common and beneficial way how to be employed if you have one employer and is working 40 hours per week. This is the relationship you all want to be found in. Then there's the agreement. No obligatory social and health payments in each case. Income up to 10,000 Czech crowns in agreement to complete a job, and 2,999 in agreement to perform work. It's the advantage is a little bigger salary because there's no taxation if you stay under these amounts. The biggest disadvantage is there's no social securities. So usually, as I said, there's a very common way is that the employer is trying to have you sign agreement to complete a job with the salary up to 10,000 Czech crowns. That is the cheapest way for both sides. But the disadvantage, no sickness benefit, no future pension. The self-employed persons, there's something on the other side. It means that you're like a businessman itself. Health insurance and pensions is mandatory. So is the sickness, but the sickness insurance is not mandatory. You have to pay that, but it's always calculated from your income. There's a possibility of voluntary payment for sickness insurance. It's up to you if you want to pay that or not. This relationship is very special. It's like B2B relationship, not subordinary as the employment relationship. There's another chart for you. There's overview of insurance. I'm not going to go through the chart. Hopefully it is cleared from everyone. If not, as well, do not hesitate to contact me. I'll be happy to explain some more to you later. So I was asked to do a few examples. What if you have more types of contracts at a time, and what is considered as main? So there are three examples. If you have only trade license activities, so you're the osovače or the businessman, you have no labor relationship. So in this case, the trade license activity, so the osovače, must be called a main activity. So there's an obligation from you to pay at least a certain minimum amount for social and health insurance. It's called povinné minimální zálohy na sociální a zdravotní pojištění, no matter what the real profit is. But if the profit goes higher, it's calculated from the past year, and the social and health insurance is going to get higher. The state is going to calculate it for you, and they're going to ask you to pay more money. It's always calculated from the profit. But if you have only the trade license, no other labor relationship, you always have to pay the minimum amount. The other example is if you have trade license activities and employment relationship. Employment relationship is considered the main activity in a situation. So it's up to you if you choose to say that the trade license is not your main activity, you call it a secondary activity. There's still an obligation to pay health and social insurance, but there's not the minimum amount to pay. So it's going to be calculated from the real profit, and that's going to be probably smaller than the obligatory minimum amount. The third example is that you have trade license activities and the agreements. The agreements can be considered as main activity if you are over the limitations, which is 10,000 Czech crowns for the DPP and 3,000 Czech crowns from the DPC. If you have that, you can consider the trade license activities as secondary activity, and it's calculated the same way as the example before. So it must be paid, but it's not the obligatory minimum, and it's calculated from the real profit. Well, that's all I have for you. For now, thank you for your attention. As I told you, if you have any question, there'll be time right now after the presentation to answer your questions. If you have any questions later, feel free to contact me on the email address or my phone number. Thank you very much.